get our work done so we truly can make it in America. With that, Madam President, I would suggest the absence of the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
A quorum call on the floor of the Senate this afternoon. General speeches for the rest of the day until about 6 p.m. Eastern. Earlier, Senate Republicans blocked President Obama's nominee to head the government agency that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Lawmakers voted 56 to 42 for Congressman Mel Watt's nomination, but that was not enough. He was 4 votes shy of the 60 needed to stop Republican efforts to delay the nomination. Now, before that took place, former Newark, New Jersey Mayor Democrat Cory Booker was sworn in as a senator from New Jersey. Senator Booker was elected to fill out the term of the late Senator Frank Lautenberg, who died earlier this year. And with that, Democrats are now in control of 55 seats in the Senate, counting 2 held by independents. Republicans have 45. So it'll be general speeches in the Senate for the rest of the afternoon until 6 Eastern. From the AP, the Associated Press this afternoon, Obama administration officials have been defending U.S. efforts in Syria today against blistering criticism from Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Republicans charged that the administration has goals but no strategy that would bring a political resolution to end the bloody conflict. The U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, told the panel that the U.S. is proud of the humanitarian and other assistance it has given to the Syrian opposition trying to topple the government of Bashar al-Assad. While this quorum call continues, we'll show you now a discussion on the Iranian nuclear program from earlier this week, hosted by George Washington University.
Forward. And Ambassador Miller said this succinctly. I'll be a little less succinct, but I think it's worth bearing down a little because we live in an age where we're driven by opinion and taking a stand, and many times in the media world people say things that are assumptions and they aren't necessarily fact. So it's a good idea, especially as we're at George Washington University, to push ourselves on this pedagogy. And this may seem basic, but I think it's also fundamental. On Iran's nuclear program, it is worth recalling the collective wisdom of the U.S. intelligence community about Iran's nuclear calculations per the testimony of James Clapper, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence on March 12, 2013. And I'm quoting him. "We assess Iran is developing nuclear capabilities to enhance its security, prestige, and regional influence, and give it the ability to develop nuclear weapons should a decision be made to do so. We do not know if Iran will eventually decide to build nuclear weapons." The collective wisdom of our national intelligence community, and I'm not saying that's gospel, but it's important, we don't know if they're developing nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not a nuclear specialist, you know, I try to talk to people and read things that are authoritative, and those of you who want to follow this and know what we all know, you should read the quarterly reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors. You can get them online, the reports on the Iranian program. And there are many questions about the program that Iran has been asked to address and which they have not addressed to this point. And this is at the core of the negotiations. The report, however, does not say that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability, but they raise many questions about the direction of the program. So this is what we know about what we don't know. Now, again, being at a university, and I'm not always in an academic context, I did go to school down the road at SAIS a while back, but I'll take the advantage here to say many people, again, make certain assumptions about Iran's intentions in negotiations, but I'd make the case here, to use a political science term, that we're dealing with a rational actor situation. Iran is making a choice, has a choice before it. And this seems supported by recent events. On the one hand, why would Iran pursue a nuclear weapon? Well, look at the region it lives in. It's got a nuclear power, Pakistan, on its border, with which they have not had fantastic relations over the years. A hostile relationship with Saudi Arabia, with whom it's fighting a proxy war in Syria. A 3-decade hostile relationship with the United States, which has led an international effort at sanctions, which has wrecked the Iranian economy. and for which Iran needs relief, and this is a key motivation, I think, for the latest diplomatic flurry by Tehran. And in the broadest strategic context, a concern about Israel, which itself considers an Iranian nuclear weapon an existential threat. Those might be incentives to pursue a nuclear weapon. Or perhaps it might not pursue a nuclear weapon if there are incentives at lifting the economic siege, providing economic reliefs to its people, and some assurances of a reduction in regional security, which may be the motivations for the program in the first place. So I come back again, when we think about Iran, to a choice and a broader analytical appeal, with all due respect to Iranian culture and history, and we should be informed by that, and the ideology of the revolution and the government there, which should not be dismissed. But from a process point, an American diplomatic point, there is every reason to test these propositions in a rational way and not dismiss them. Iran is weighing its choices, and that assessment by DNI Clapper was before the election of Hassan Rouhani, which could be, I think, fairly interpreted as a call for change, and before the diplomatic blitz by him and his foreign minister, and in a new approach, a more open and constructive approach that has been recognized by all of the P5+1 partners. So in terms of whether it's cosmetic or it's real, in terms of the diplomatic process that's before us, I don't know how it plays out, but the process, yeah, it's real, because not seeing it is denying the hand in front of your face, because this is what's happening before our eyes. Now, there was a comment about some constraints we might deal with, and I'll touch on that one briefly. But let me tell you another one, and all my colleagues mentioned it briefly. The issue of time is really critical here, and I'm not going to get into the Congress or what's happening in Iran, because others have addressed that and said the things I would otherwise say. But these types of think about the context of negotiations with Iran. 30 years of a hostile relationship. And think of the time pressures in that context that we put on a meeting that takes place how soon after Rouhani came to office? How soon after the first serious proposal or discussions in early October in Geneva? Think of that context. Now, the constraints are real here in the United States and there in Iran from varying interests. But that is a loaded relationship with a lot of bad blood, as we would say, in terms of, you go back to the bombing of our Marine barracks in Lebanon by Hezbollah, the shooting down of the Iranian Airbus in 1989 or 88 by the U.S. naval vessel, the Vincennes, and we could go on and on about what's happened. This is a hostile, bitter relationship. And the diplomatic trend, which I think is real, is very fragile. And to put things in context, I just went through and did a list, so we're talking about how fast we got to move. The U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Negotiations began in May 2004. It went into effect May 2012. Two friendly countries both having an interest in it. There are domestic politics and all that stuff, as this always happens, right? U.S.-Korea free trade. The first round, February 2006. There were renegotiations. It went into effect March 2012. The New START Treaty. Formal negotiations began 2009. This was a fast one. This ended in February 2011. Put this in context. Those are countries that we have established relationships and diplomatic channels and all these things, and look at how it took, and then look at the time constraints we're dealing with Iran. It's very tricky, very difficult, and I think the details have all been laid out well. You know, at Monitor, what we try to do, and those of you who don't know us, check us out at elmonitor.com, is what we try to do is identify trends in the region, and the way we get at trends is we try to have the best reporters and analysts there, writing in their languages, which we translate, and then it goes up, and that's how I learn a lot of stuff. And one of the trends we've looked at, and again, this is related to Iran, is the U.S.-Russia cooperation on the CW destruction in Syria. We're not talking about U.S.-Russia relations here, but everything's kind of related when it comes to the region. I'll get into the Syria piece in just a minute. I can personally consider that a landmark agreement. And it's also the issue of chemical weapons has been an area where there's some kind of potential understanding with Iran. In April, we picked up a quote that didn't get a lot of play where the former Iranian foreign minister referred to the use of chemical weapons in Syria as a red line. He used Obama's own words. The UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeff Feltman, the highest-ranking American at the United Nations and a former Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and Ambassador to Lebanon, was in Iran in August, talking with them prior to the U.S.-Russia deal as things were being worked out. These things were being discussed. And I interviewed Foreign Minister Zarif when he was in New York, and basically the headline is, he said, look, we have this history of use of chemical weapons, and we've destroyed chemical weapons. We can help in this process, and they supported this process all along. In fact, an Iranian deputy foreign minister was in Moscow when the agreement was announced, an interesting coincidence. And they've been willing to help and been involved in this process. While we're on the subject of Syria, and let's think about Syria for a minute. You know, one of our writers who's based here in Washington, Jeffrey Aronson, said something fascinating about Syria in a recent article. He said, Syria is the arena where the basic prerequisites for progress on the U.S.-Iran agenda, recognizing core interests and fashioning mechanisms to safeguard them, are being forged in word and in deed. So let's look at Syria. No question that Iran is the #1 backer of the Syrian government, of Bashar al-Assad, as is Hezbollah. And that support has been critical to the success the regime has had, being backed forced. So that's a key part of it. And that's why Iran is essential to the diplomatic process, because there's no diplomacy or any type of end to the war in Syria unless you deal with Iran. You know,
Senator from Nevada.
I ask the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to address the public revelations regarding classified government surveillance programs. But before I do so, I'd like to take a moment to honor Mike Lansbury, who died a hero's death in Sparks, Nevada last week. After spotting a student with a gun at Sparks Middle School, Mr. Lansbury moved directly in harm's way to protect his students and others from danger, and he was fatally shot. Mr. Lansbury was an Alabama native, a graduate of McQueen High School in Sparks and a University of Nevada, Reno graduate, and a decorated Master Sergeant in the Nevada Guard Airmen. To his students, he was a coach. He was a teacher, and he was also a mentor. To his community, Mr. Lansbury was a patriot, a father, and a friend. Master Sergeant Lansbury leaves behind a legacy of self-sacrifice and service to his country and community. He will continue to be remembered as a great and honorable man and a father. Thank you, Madam President. I'd also like to discuss briefly current National Security Agency practices, including its bulk data collection programs and the implication these programs have for the privacy of Nevadans and millions of other law-abiding citizens. Due to published reports in newspapers around the world, Nevadans are well aware that the federal government has been collecting phone data of law-abiding citizens without their knowledge through a process known as bulk collection. These practices are mostly authorized by Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Specifically, Section 215 permits the FBI to seek a court order directing a business to turn over certain records when there are reasonable grounds to believe that the information sought is relevant to an authorized investigation of international terrorism. Madam President, relevance has been found by the courts to be a broad standard that, in effect, allows large volumes of data to be collected. These same records can be combed through in order to identify smaller amounts of information that are relevant to an ongoing investigation. So to put it in other words, it's been established that Section 215 allows for massive amounts of data to be collected in order to find the tiny amount of data that would solve an investigation regarding international terrorism. The courts reason that this is permitted because when submitted, it is likely that the data will produce information that will then help the FBI. Millions of Americans' call records are collected and stored by the NSA because a few numbers may solve an authorized investigation. Supporters of bulk collection practices have defended this program as an important tool in the fight against terror. They have said that this is a mechanism to access the logs quickly, and they are not actually listening to the content. President Obama even said, and I'll quote, "When it comes to telephone calls, nobody is listening to your telephone call. Instead, the government was just sifting through this so-called metadata." Madam President, the President is right. He is correct. They aren't listening to the actual calls like the FBI conducting a wiretap, but let me outline that the government can figure out what is going on from those call logs. For example, they will know that an American citizen in Ely, Nevada received a call from the local NRA office and then called their representative and senators. But they claim that the content of that call remains safe from government intrusion. Or they'll also know that a Nevadan from Las Vegas called a suicide prevention hotline and spoke to an individual for 12 minutes. But they will not know what that person discussed. The question I have is this: why does the federal government have to house this data? And it's because I believe, Madam President, that Congress has authorized a massive surrender of our constituents' privacy. And I want to be clear, I share the concerns of all Americans that we must protect ourselves against threats to the homeland. I also believe that we must continue to understand that terrorism is very real and the United States is the target of those looking to undermine the freedoms we hold as the core of our national identity. But are we sacrificing our own freedoms in the process? Are we sacrificing our constitutional rights that are afforded under the Fourth Amendment? If so, this is a steep price to pay to protect Americans from terrorism. So the next question must be, if the price to protect Americans from terrorism is an incredible loss of individual privacy, what are the results of this program? What has the bulk collection program provided in tangible results that justify a privacy intrusion of this level? Madam President, the answer is that 2 cases have been solved in the collection of millions of records through the use of the program authorized by Section 215. We know that because on October 2nd, 2013, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Leahy, asked the NSA Director, Keith Alexander, the following question, and I quote, "At our last hearing, the Deputy Director, Mr. Inglis, stated that there's only really one example of a case where, but for the use of Section 215, both phone records collection, terrorist activity was stopped. Was Mr. Inglis right?" To which the Director, Alexander, responded, I quote, "He is right. I believe he said too, Mr. Chairman." So, Madam President, Congress has authorized the collection of millions of law-abiding citizens' telephone metadata for years, and it has only solved 2 ongoing FBI investigations. Of those 2 investigations, the NSA has publicly identified 1. And in fact, that case would have easily been handled by obtaining a warrant and going to that telephone company. It is the case of an individual in San Diego who was convicted of sending $8,500 to Somalia in support of al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization, claiming responsibility for the Kenyan mall attack. The American phone records allowed the NSA to determine that a U.S. phone was used to contact an individual associated with this terrorist organization. I'm appreciative that the NSA was able to apprehend this individual, but it does not provide overwhelming evidence that this program is necessary. As Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon noted, the NSA could have gotten a court order to get the phone records in question. So, in essence, Congress has authorized a program that invades the privacy of millions of Americans with little to show for it. The results simply do not justify this massive invasion of our privacy. That is why I want to end bulk collection practices authorized under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and I join Senator Leahy to introduce the bipartisan, bicameral USA Freedom Act. This legislation, among other things, will rein in the dragnet collection of data by the National Security Agency. It will stop the bulk collection of Americans' communications records by ending the authorization provided by Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Some in this chamber will argue that this removes a massive tool for the NSA to assist the FBI. I disagree with that. All this legislation does is shut down the collection of millions of Americans' metadata by the NSA. If the FBI needs a telephone number, they can go to a FISA judge and get a warrant. The phone company can still provide that data. And chances are the major phone provider will have that data, as they keep all detailed records for at least a year. When talking broadly about how certain technological developments should be incorporated in our justice system, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court William Douglas once said, "The privacy and dignity of our citizens are being whittled away by something imperceptible steps. Taken individually, each step may be of little consequence. But when viewed as a whole, there begins to emerge a society quite unlike any we have seen, a society in which government may intrude into the secret regions of a person's life." Unquote. Here is the United States Congress. It is our responsibility to take great care to acknowledge each possible step that could whittle away our privacy. We must examine its necessity carefully and reasonably, and in this case, I do not believe such practices are warranted. Madam President, we can continue to protect our Americans from threats of terrorism without infringing on individual privacy that the Constitution protects under the Fourth Amendment. We should shut down bulk collection practices. And with that, Madam President, I thank you, and I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
General speeches expected in the Senate for the rest of the day while we wait for further debate. Earlier today, we spoke with David Corn of the magazine Mother Jones from this morning's Washington Journal.
Well, Mother Jones has been around since 1976, and this morning, Washington Bureau Chief David Corn joins us from the magazine's D.C. offices. Good morning, Mr. Corn. Thanks for coming on.
Good morning. Glad to be with you.
We'll be talking about the history, the mission of your publication. Let's start with how Mother Jones got started and how you came up with the name Mother Jones.
Well, I wasn't there when when it happened. It was back in the 70s, and it was a bunch of folks, progressive journalists and some activists who wanted to put together a magazine, a media entity that would do some real kick-ass reporting, what they saw not happening within the mainstream media. And they really wanted the emphasis to be on investigations, not on, ranting and raving and analyses and so on. And they put together the magazine, and it started out as a monthly, and very soon it was breaking news about a lot of corporate malfeasance, political corruption, money in politics. Those have been some of our core issues ever since. And the name was named after Mary Jo Harris, who called herself Mother Jones, who was a labor leader, an activist. She called herself a hellraiser. Back in the 20th century, 100 years ago or so, and they were kind of stuck. They had the project all plotted out and the type of magazine they wanted to do, and they were stuck on a name. And they were about to do a mass mailing to get subscribers, which is how you did it back in those days. And they were all ready to go. They needed a name, and someone at the table suggested this, and they all said, "Yeah, great name," and that's what happened.
And what is the mission of Mother Jones today?
Well, our tagline is smart, fearless journalism, and that's what we aim to do again and again and again. We want to illuminate and educate, engage on subject matters that we think are very important. They can be money in politics, they can be climate change, the state of politics, the influence of power in America, and like I said, the earlier mission was, we are reporting driven. If you look behind me, I don't know what you can see out there, but we have 10 reporters in this bureau alone. We have reporters in other places as well. And we don't focus on commentary. We don't focus on a lot of political analysis. We do some of that, but mainly we focus on reporting stories that we find are important. They can be things that are in the news, and we report them out in a way that's unique and different than what's happening in the rest of the media, or they can be things that are totally different, but they're quite important, that are not getting the attention that we believe they should be getting.
What do you think the status of investigative journalism is today for magazines? Are there too many magazines that focus on opinion writing?
Well, I think there's a lot less investigative reporting in what I would call the mainstream media. And I use that phrase not in a pejorative sense. Call it established media, legacy media. I think their newsrooms and their news budgets have been squeezed tremendously over the last 10 years, and they just don't devote all the resources they should. In the meantime, I see the rise of nonprofit journalism, and I should say Mother Jones is a nonprofit entity. So if anyone gives us money, you can get a little bit of a tax write-off, not much, but a little. But us and ProPublica, and there's the Center for Investigative Reporting, and things like that are out there trying to fill the gap. But I do think that overall, our media landscape is being driven increasingly by the news of the moment, whether it's celebrity news or political news, real news, and that there's a lot less time and energy and resources available for doing deep dives or for looking at things that are not in the immediate spotlight, that are not in front of us as we're all on our Twitter-like hamster wheel.
If viewers have questions or comments for David Corn, the Bureau Chief of Mother Jones, the lines are open this morning. Republicans can call it 202-585-3881. Democrats, 202-585-3880. Independents, 585-3882. We'll be talking to him for about the next 40 minutes or so on the Washington Journal. And Mr. Corn, as we lay out those lines, I want to talk to you about how you prefer to describe your magazine. Is it progressive? Is liberal a term? And what do you say to folks who call your magazine, as it's listed on your frequently asked questions page, a lefto-pinko rag?
Well, I say they're wrong. I mean, we are a progressive-driven organization, you know, and the way I look at it is I tend to see our political values, our overarching values, as really determining more of what we cover and how we look at the world and what subjects, what areas we decide to focus on. Because we don't do a lot of commentary, as I noted, you know, the political value biases of people who work here and reporters are not as important. Because we really are about digging out new facts. I mean, I really think that the killer app these days is telling people things they don't know. And, you know, there's, you know, with the rise of the internet and the growth of blogging and tweeting and everything else, you know, getting opinion, getting views is really easy these days. Everybody, you know, an opinion is like a backside. Everyone has one. But you know, getting well-developed stories that require reporting and require, you know, time and expertise is very difficult. And we get most of our traffic online when we produce a story that people say, oh my God, look at this, I got to read this because I want to know the facts here. I mean, that's where that's where it comes in. So, you know, in those sort of stories, whether you're a conservative or liberal doesn't really matter as much. But we don't hide the fact that we consider ourselves a progressive organization, and that shapes the way we see our mission.
Well, let's talk about your latest piece this morning on Mother Jones' website. Ted Cruz's dad calls U.S. a Christian nation, says Obama should go, quote, back to Kenya. Tell us about this piece.
Well, this story came about because I spent a couple days looking at videos of Rafael Cruz, who is the 75-year-old father of Senator Ted Cruz. Rafael Cruz is an evangelical pastor, lives in Texas. He is an immigrant from Cuba. He used to be a businessman before he turned towards preaching. And I found a lot of excessive or extreme rhetoric in videos of him speaking at Republican and Tea Party groups. Now, people may say, wait a second, you know, you can't blame the son for the rhetoric or sins of the father. And that's usually the case. I wouldn't want to be held accountable for what my parents had to say. But there's one big exception here. Ted Cruz uses his father extensively as a campaign surrogate. He campaigns with him. During his campaign in 2012, his Senate campaign in Texas, he sent Rafael Cruz to Republican groups, to Tea Party groups, to speak on his behalf. So it's like if your campaign manager or a running mate or somebody made these comments. So I found a lot of, you know, to me, surprising in how extreme they were, remarks that Rafael Cruz was making, in which he says things like, the United States is a Christian nation. He doesn't even use the Judeo-Christian nation that a lot of evangelicals like to use. He said that President Barack Obama, this is a quote, is destroying the concept of God. Accuses the president of destroying the concept of God. He says that, you know, voters should send Obama back to Kenya. So he sounds like a birther there. You know, he's given sermons in which he says women should not be the spiritual leaders of their homes and families. That's a job only for men. Women do it only if the men don't do it. He is, you know, ardently against gay rights, but he calls gay rights a conspiracy to make government your God. I don't quite follow the logic there, but that's what he has said. He calls
the Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I recently received a disturbing note from a constituent in Burlington, Kentucky. And unfortunately, I suspect a lot of my colleagues have been receiving notes just like it. This gentleman said that after receiving several letters from his insurer, it became clear to him that the president was being misleading when he said that if you like the plan you have, you can keep it. That's because he found out that his policy, which came into effect just 2 months after the law's arbitrary cutoff date for grandfathered plans, will be discontinued next year. And he's not happy about this at all, especially given the fact that a plan on the Obamacare exchanges will dramatically drive up his insurance costs from $400 a month to more than $700 a month with zero subsidies available. Here's what he had to say. He said, "My wife and I are 54. We don't need maternity care, and we don't need Obamacare." Well, he's right to be upset. This is simply not in keeping with the spirit of the president's oft-repeated promise. Perhaps the administration would like to tell him he should have just done a better job of keeping up with its regulatory diktats. But what about the millions who purchased their plans relying on the president's promise that they could keep them? What about the husbands and wives across Kentucky who suffered when 2 of our largest employers had to drop spousal coverage? What about the folks who lost coverage at work? What about all the smaller paychecks and lost jobs? What about the part-timization of our economy? This law, Mr. President, is a mess. It's a mess. As Secretary Sebelius has said herself yesterday, the system is not functioning. Now, maybe she was referring to no more than the narrow problems with healthcare.gov, but as the president keeps reminding us over and over again, Obamacare is about more than just a website. He's right about that. And that's why, if the system is not functioning, it's just another sign that Obamacare itself is simply not working. The president and his Washington Democrat allies understand this. That's why the White House is so eager to enroll everybody, other than themselves, into the exchanges. It's why they handed out a year-long delay to businesses. And that's why the Washington Democrats' big labor allies are looking for their own special carve-outs. Well, what about everybody else? What about the middle class? Where's their carve-out? So far, Washington Democrats have resisted every attempt to exempt the struggling constituents that we all represent. The folks who rammed this partisan bill through know it's not ready for prime time. And they seem to want no part of it themselves. But for you out there, the middle class, it seems to be tough luck. Tough luck. We've even seen some of the same folks try to stamp out innovations that would help folks get out from under some of Obamacare's more crushing burdens. That's why they've launched a crusade against small businesses who dare experiment with self-insurance and other pioneering ideas. Maybe the administration doesn't like self-insurance because it represents a free market alternative to Obamacare. But the fact is, nearly 100 million Americans are already availing themselves of it. And I'm sure most of them really like the greater flexibility and affordability it provides. So it's time these folks spent their energy working with us to look after the middle class and to bring about the kind of reforms that will actually lower costs and that our constituents want. Because they shouldn't have to wake up to news like this. Florida Blue is dropping 300,000 customers. Hundreds of thousands of New Jerseyans opened the mail last week to find their health insurance plan would no longer exist in 2014, out of existence. Half of the roughly 600,000 people in my state of Kentucky in the private insurance market will have their current insurance plans discontinued. 300,000 Kentuckians will have their current insurance plans discontinued. This isn't fair. It's not what Americans were promised. And Republicans intend to keep fighting for the middle-class families suffering under this law. I hope more of our Democratic colleagues will join us in this battle in the future. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, thank you, Tommy, for that thorough and entertaining introduction. Not necessarily fully accurate, but maybe somewhat close. And I want to thank the National Press Club for what you do to bring really thoughtful voices to issues that are sometimes complex, like what I'm going to talk about today. But before I start, I want to give a nod to Tommy's paper, which is the Salt Lake Tribune. And I want you to all pay attention to this because they're responsible for the best ever question that I've had from the media in my time as a professional. So my great colleague, Kate Kelly, somewhere around here, where's Kate? She does a really good job. Over there, hiding in the background. Kate called for the last question in this meeting I was having with the Salt Lake Tribune. And this individual said, I have a question. I was hiking in Grand Teton National Park, and there were warnings about bears everywhere. So I was walking along the trail, and I came across something on the trail that made me really nervous. And so I turned around and went back to my car, and I want to know if I really needed to go back to my car. So he held up his phone with a picture, and he said, is this bear poop? Isn't that great? And the good thing is I actually knew the answer. And the answer was no, you could have kept on your hike. I mean, they may have been bears, but they weren't pooping there on the trail. It was a large ungulate that had pooped there a while ago. So, you know, it was pretty obvious for those of you that know scat. Anyway, I have a broad portfolio at Interior, and I'm not going to try and cover the landscape at this time. My focus today is on the administration's conservation agenda, and that's what I'm going to concentrate my words today with. So as Tommy mentioned in the introduction, I've been in the private sector for a while. Even before I graduated from college, I worked on aspects of the Alaska Pipeline, which is what got me into the oil and gas industry to begin with. As a banker, I learned about a ton of things, not just banking natural resources companies involved in timber or agriculture or mining or oil and gas, but also real estate and retail and all kinds of other businesses that make up this great country we've been a part of. And then at REI, yes, it's a big player in the industry, but the industry is 100 miles wide and a quarter of an inch deep. It's a $646 billion driver of economic activity to the United States. That's huge. It's bigger than pharmaceuticals. It's bigger than a number of industries that would surprise you. And that's outdoor recreation. So yes, REI is $2 billion. It seems big, but relative to outdoor recreation, it's not. And that's a very important part of our economy. And one of the reasons that I enthusiastically answered the President's call to take this job, because our public lands are important in so many ways. They drive our economies, but they also drive things that fill the soul and help define who we are as a nation. So at Interior, one of the main reasons I took this job is you've got to seize an opportunity to make a difference. We have a chance to make a difference at Interior on some of the defining issues of our time, like climate change. Being out in the resource in so many places from 71 degrees north latitude to 7 degrees north latitude in one trip, you see the impacts of climate change everywhere. Like moving our country toward energy independence, which is also really important, but also honoring our proud conservation legacy. So I want to thank President Obama for his confidence in me, and I want to thank the Senate for agreeing with him and putting me in here as Secretary of Interior. So that's the job. Now the timing, that was a little off, right? I come into thinking great long-term, thinking about the future of our public lands, to the continuing resolution that's been funding us, you know, a few months at a time since 2012. And then just as I started in April, sequestration hit. That is the nuttiest thing the business person has ever heard of, let me tell you. 5% across the board cuts, including the things that were most important that you really had to focus on, had to get cut, along with things where you might say, you know, that could wait a while. And so we had to cut across the board, and the impact was really severe. And so I hope this is behind us very soon. But most recently, the pièce de la résistance, the 16-day, absurd, wasteful government shutdown. I got to tell you, you had to have a sense of humor through that process because it's pretty frustrating. And so I have to tell you a story about a family friend that makes wine. And they sent me a bottle of wine, and they made it themselves. And the label was the Capitol Dome with a "Sorry, we're closed" sign on it. And the name of the wine, you got to love this, Furlough Merlot. But I have to say, you know, it hasn't been so funny to be a government employee. So before I keep going, I just want to have all the government employees that are in this room raise their hands so that we can all thank them. I know there's a bunch of you at this table. Raise your hands, guys. Let's give them a hand. So for more than 2 weeks, employees had to stay home from jobs that they loved. And they had to watch things on the news, and they wanted to be helpful, and they weren't allowed to be. The U.S. Geological Survey, which we all rely on a lot more than we know, had to hit pause on important scientific research, in some cases losing an entire year's worth of data because it was time-sensitive to this season. The Bureau of Land Management, a complicated organization that manages vast lands, had to halt energy permitting on projects that were very important to industry. And Indian Affairs, the part of Interior that serves individuals directly, couldn't provide critical support to tribal nations. I got to tell you, that was very, very frustrating, whether you were working around the clock like some of us were, or whether you were forced to stay home and you wanted to be part of the solution. It was very frustrating. So I want you just to take a walk down what that 2 weeks was like with me. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the park ranger that had to call the bride and groom and say, sorry, you know that wedding you have planned in the national park? You're going to have to make other arrangements. There were something like a dozen weddings planned on some of the key spots around Washington, D.C. that had to be shuttered. There were weddings planned in national parks around the country. Or how about that Fish and Wildlife Service employee who is on to protect the resource but had to close the refuge, who's talking to the guide service that has clients that waited forever for that coveted tag to try and hunt a bighorn sheep that were told that they couldn't come to the refuge and hunt because it was closed. Public servants were forced to do the opposite of what they love and what they want to do, which is welcoming people to our public lands. So that's the human side. The shutdown also had a huge economic impact on local businesses and gateway communities that rely on public lands for their bread and butter. So a couple weeks ago, actually I guess it was last weekend, I thought, I'm new to this part of the country, I better go enjoy some of this fall foliage now that the shutdown's over. So I went to Shenandoah. And the trees were pretty bare at the top, but I descended 2,000 feet through some beautiful forests and back up the other side. You know, in the West, you hike up to the destination and come down. It's different here. But I also visited with the park rangers, thanked them for being back on the job, learned a few of their stories, and the concessionaire, who there lost $2 million just in that 16-day period that they won't make up, because you're not going to get the October of 2013 back again that you lost. So all told, we estimate that the closure of the national park system alone, not including any of the other federal lands we talk about, cost local communities at least $76 million a day in lost revenue. But if there's a silver lining to all of this, and there's almost always some sort of a silver lining, it's that the shutdown shined a spotlight on just how much Americans love and value their public lands and the people who serve them. So, at the risk of you yelling at me later for putting a song in your head that won't go away, I am going to quote from a Joni Mitchell song. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You can sing the rest. The shutdown clarified for all of us what's at stake. It reminded us that our parks, our wildlife refuges, and our public lands are uniquely ours. They're uniquely American. They're the places we go with our families to recreate, to seek beauty, to find solitude. They're our watersheds, our wildlife habitat. They're our economic engines. They're our sources of pride and history. They're where our diverse stories are celebrated. So this reminder about the value of our public lands has come at an important time in our history, when the demands on our lands and water are greater than ever. We've got a growing population, we have the very real effects of climate change, and we have constrained resources. And all of these things are coming together to place increasing pressures on our landscapes and waterways. At the same time, we stand at the doorstep of the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. In 2016, we'll celebrate what has been called America's Best Idea, the democratic concept that for the first time in human history, land would be set aside not for kings or the very rich, but for everybody. And next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, a historic bipartisan law that has resulted in millions of acres protected for the benefit of current and future generations of Americans. So in this country, at this time of year, you can go out and hear elk bugling. You can witness bears preparing their dens for the winter. You can see millions of birds flying south for the winter. So there are happy bird watchers and hunters and hikers and people out for a Sunday drive all over this country thanks to the lands that have been protected. So we stand together at this juncture. It's very important now that we think about what conservation legacy we want to leave for the next 50 years or the next 100 years. Do we want a legacy of short-sighted funding and partisan gridlock that we've witnessed in Congress over the last few years? I don't think so. I'm thinking in particular about some members of the House of Representatives who've proposed to slash funding for the National Park Service by 13%, or gut the Fish and Wildlife Service by nearly a third, or cut $100 million from the Bureau of Land Management's operating budget, and that is one agency that operates at a bare-bones level. I'm also thinking about a Congress that since 2010 hasn't acted to protect a single new acre of public land as a national park, a monument, or a wilderness area. Not one. Or do we want a legacy of people I've met, like Jim and Carol Falstich, who are ranchers in South Dakota, who are leading an effective grassroots effort to protect, with private landowners like themselves, to protect the prairie potholes region and the key habitat for ducks and other waterfowl. This area of our country that's been called the nation's duck factory, about 50% of our waterfowl come through the prairie potholes. Or like Lefty Durando, he's a rancher in Florida, who's working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other private landowners to conserve the Everglades headwaters and to pass on our nation's ranching heritage to the next generation, but also provide clean water to 7 million people in South Florida. And, oh, by the way, restore that river of grass, that ecosystem that is so important. It's one of the most noted in the world. Or how about people I worked with when I was back in my home community of Seattle, and many, many like them around the country, who work with states and communities to pass measures every year to fund open spaces and build new parks. I know where President Obama stands on this. The President believes that we have a moral obligation to the next generation to leave our land, our water, and wildlife better than we found it. That's why he launched the America's Great Outdoors program in 2010, and I was pleased as a business person to participate in that. That's why he's taking comprehensive action to cut carbon pollution and slow the effects of climate change that I've seen every time I've been out in the resource. And that's why he's used his authority time and again to protect some of the places that Americans love most. In my conversations with the President, he's told me how his visits to national parks and seashores with his mom and his grandmother shaped him as a young man, and how he shared that same experience with his daughters at the rim of the Grand Canyon, a place that was set aside for future generations, even as our country then was growing by leaps and bounds. In remarks last year, President Obama invoked the words of Aldo Leopold, reminding us that conservation is not just about doing nothing. It's about doing something affirmative to make sure that we're passing along this incredible blessing that we have. So I look forward to working with the President, my colleagues in the Cabinet, and Congress, as well as local communities across this country as we enter the second century of American conservation. So how do we get there? Well, at a start, Congress should get back to regular order, please, and pass the President's budget, or a budget that's close to that. And I will say that there are members of the House and the Senate who understand these issues, and they're very supportive. Congress needs to deliver a sustainable, thoughtful budget that supports our parks, our forests, our refuges, our rivers, and conservation lands, and in turn strengthens our economy, particularly the economy in rural areas. Because the real test of whether you support conservation is not what you say at a press conference, even though I understand those are important, but whether you fight for it in the budget conference. That's where the rubber hits the road. Congress also needs to fulfill a promise made to Americans through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or what we call LWCF. LWCF is an innovative program that since 1964, coming up on its 50th anniversary, has used revenues from offshore oil and gas development, and we know there are impacts of offshore oil and gas development, to enhance parks and open spaces in every county across the country Personally, in my home state of Washington, the other Washington, LWCF funds have been used to do things like pay for easements for hunters to have access to lands that are important to them, or to provide matching grants to communities that want to improve local parks or set aside open spaces as they grow. This program, LWCF, was an early, important, and visionary effort at balancing the impact of development with the opportunity to support public lands and resources. So rather than zeroing out the fund, as some have proposed to do, Congress should adopt President Obama's budget proposal to enact mandatory full funding of LWCF by 2015. This is money that has been going into the Treasury every year since 1964 that was set aside for this, and it's only been funded once at its full allocated level since its enactment, and it's time to do that fully. Congress should also continue to fund other key successful programs like the North American Wetlands Conservation Grants to fuel our work with communities, hunters, and landowners. And finally, Congress needs to get moving to pass dozens of locally supported bills introduced by both Republicans and Democrats that protect the places that Americans care about most and places that their constituents have said are important to them. Like the Omnibus Public Lands Act, where the President and Congress worked together in 2009 to protect 2 million acres of wilderness and designate over 1,100 miles of wild and scenic river. These are the kind of common-sense, bipartisan actions that Americans want to see Congress take. But we cannot and we will not hold our breath forever. We owe it to future generations to act. So just as the President has already demonstrated on 9 occasions, he's ready and willing to step up where Congress falls short. The national monuments and national wildlife refuges that he has established over the last 4 years provide important protections for special places, like the Rio Grande del Norte in New Mexico, or they preserve key chapters in our nation's story, like that of Cesar Chavez or Harriet Tubman. There are many more special places just like that, and many more stories that need to be told. In the coming weeks and months, I will be on the road, I'll be meeting with communities, I'll be evaluating opportunities where action can ensure that our nation's stories and landscapes are honored, celebrated, and preserved for the generations to come. So the next topic I want to cover deals with what some see as the quintessential issue for Interior. This is a difficult agency. We have a lot of priorities that we balance. Specifically, how do we strike the right balance for development and conservation to ensure that we serve our nation's needs now and far into the future? So part of this is encouraging development in the right ways and in the right places. Part of that is recognizing there's some places that are too special to develop, and I've been to one of them. I've been to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's an amazing place. My first evening there, I counted 29 polar bears who had left the ice to come to shore to find food. It is an extraordinary place. And you never look at nature quite the same way when you've been there. Today we have an unprecedented opportunity, using science and technology, to create a better understanding of landscapes than ever before, to advance important conservation goals and achieve our development objectives together. It's not an either-or. It can't be. We're already seeing this approach work as we seek to meet President Obama's goal of approving 20,000 megawatts of renewable energy on public lands by 2020. It's a goal toward which my predecessor, Ken Salazar, made huge strides. For example, in Southern California, we're working with the state on something called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. It's an ambitious plan to cite renewable energy, but also to understand conservation objectives. In that region, we're going to be blending science and satellite data, identifying the areas of highest energy potential, but also high-priority conservation lands in the Mojave Desert. It's interesting because I happen to know 2 young scientists who both did some of their early work after graduating from school by counting desert tortoises. And I knew nothing about why they were counting desert tortoises until I came to this job. And they were doing work on behalf of the USGS and the Fish and Wildlife Service to understand this habitat. So we've also, beyond the desert southwest and the Mojave Desert, we've also employed this landscape-level approach in Alaska, where we took a comprehensive look at the National Petroleum Reserve to protect over 13 million acres, like key caribou habitat around Teshekpuk Lake. while also making available for development 72% of the estimated economically recoverable oil. So I was in the North Slope, Barrow, Alaska, meeting with the Inupiaq people who reminded me of the importance of caribou, not only for subsistence, but also for their cultural traditions, but also told me that energy development was important to them. It's economic activity that helps give them jobs and fuels their local economy. These are both important, but it's also important for us to get it right. So the type of smart, balanced approach to development is especially what we need in new frontiers like the Arctic, or in the development of master leasing plans, or in places like the Bakken region of North Dakota, where we're experiencing a major energy boom. I went and visited the Bakken. Some of you have probably seen pictures of the development going on there. And I will say, it's also right on the boundary of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I think I saw Teddy over there. Welcome. I know it's Halloween, but I think you just come back from the dead to join us. So we're taking care of your park, except there's oil and gas development going near it, and we're trying to work on that. So I just have to say, during that visit, where I learned a lot about how companies were directionally drilling to have a smaller footprint on the land than the drilling methods that were used when I was in the industry, I also went out to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and I met with Superintendent Naylor, who just got an award for the work that she did in working with developers there to help them recognize the impact of development on the national park. And she described it as something like playing whack-a-mole, where just as she thought she had one area protected and had worked with companies who were going to develop there, and they decided to move based on a conversation with her, she had someone else over here. And she said, I live in fear of taking a few days off. We want to help people like Superintendent Naylor, because she's just one of hundreds of superintendents or wildlife refuge managers around the country that understand the critical nature of the landscapes surrounding their park or their refuge or the public land, and want to be able to work closely with businesses to understand what's at stake so that everybody can make smarter decisions. So under my leadership at Interior, we will always take the long view, even when our budgets don't. And we will always, always keep in mind that public lands are a trust, one that we manage for generations to come. That's why today I'm issuing my first secretarial order to ensure that whenever our public lands and resources are impacted by development activity, we're also considering how to mitigate these impacts at a landscape level through strategic conservation and restoration. So as a business person, I appreciate there's an important role for government to play in overseeing how our lands are developed. We rely as business people on government making those kinds of choices. I also know that there's nothing more frustrating than to be well into an investment and find your investment challenged. It gives you uncertainty. It results oftentimes in costly delays and perhaps lawsuits. But by understanding our landscapes and guiding development to the areas of highest resource value and lowest environmental concern, we can reduce the likelihood of conflict. We can help businesses drive a more predictable return on investment, and that's what they're looking for. When there are environmental impacts, businesses are going to be able to support meaningful landscape-level environmental needs rather than ad hoc project-by-project mitigation efforts. I know from my own experience that businesses want to be good stewards of the land and the areas that they live in, where their people live, where they grow up. They don't want to be part of the problem. They want to be part of the solution. This secretarial order and the work that my colleagues are going to do in Interior is going to help them do that. So finally, I can't stress enough the importance of engaging the next generation in understanding and stewarding public lands, something I was passionate about in my last job and will continue to be passionate as long as I'm on this earth. The millennial generation, representing my children, now young adults aged 18 to 33, is larger, it's more urban, and it's more diverse than any generation in our history. But research also shows that this generation cares deeply about the planet and wants to make a difference in their careers. Yet they've grown up being more disconnected from the natural world than ever before, and I could spend an entire speech talking to you just about that. This generation, the millennial generation, already outnumbers the boomer generation, my own, by 3 million people. By 2030, it'll outnumber us by 22 million. That's because a bunch of us are going to die. But this millennial generation will soon be our elected officials, our business leaders, our parents, our public servants. And what happens when we have a generation who has had little connection to our nation's public lands, yet they're suddenly in charge of taking care of them? What happens? So at Interior, this is a very real question. About a third of our 70,000 strong workforce will be eligible to retire within 5 years. We're going to need a whole new generation of wildlife biologists, of park rangers, of scientists, and other professionals to care for our lands and waters. Unfortunately, the entry-level jobs that we've relied on so much, like seasonal ranger jobs or interns or trail crews or research assistants, have been severely impacted by the indiscriminate nature of sequestration and the lack of flexibility in how we spend our limited resources. That is the one area that was whacked the most by the nature of sequestration, and we've got to get back to regular order. This is happening at a time when many of these young people are entering the workforce, and they're entering the workforce in a really tough time in our economy to find a job. So for the health of our economy, our public lands, and future generations, it's critical that we work now to establish meaningful and deep connections between young people from all backgrounds in all parts of this country and the great outdoors. So today I'm pleased to announce an ambitious initiative in Interior that we'll undertake over the next 4 years to inspire millions of young people to play, to learn, to serve, and to work in the outdoors. First, we're going to develop and enhance partnerships in 50 cities. These are cities where we'll create better opportunities for outdoor play for more than 10 million young people. Nearly 80% of our population lives in cities today, and many of these cities have open spaces that are pretty few and far between. There are programs administered by the National Park Service that have been hugely successful. Urban Parks and Recreation Program, Rivers and Trails Conservation Assistance Program. These are things that communities have relied on for a long time. And here in Washington, D.C., when many of our parks and open spaces are run by the National Park Service, you certainly felt what that like when it went away, right? Haynes Point or Rock Creek Park, where you couldn't go, and you would have before unless you went and you weren't supposed to. Anacostia Park, Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, they go on and on. We're very fortunate here. We actually have some pretty incredible public resources. But we need to bring those to other cities. Second, we're going to use the nation's best classrooms, the natural world, to provide educational opportunities to at least 10 million of the nation's K-12 students annually. So just earlier this week I was out at Dyke Marsh. It's near Alexandria. It's right along the Mount Vernon Trail. It's part of the GW Parkway, and it's a beautiful natural area that has been eroding dramatically since dredging activities happened some decades ago. I was announcing that we would be rebuilding a lot of that wetland by putting in some containment things to bring back the natural marshes. But most importantly, there were 2 school groups out there from Alexandria, young kids representing all the colors of the rainbow and all the enthusiasm that only young children can have, telling me about the pH and the water quality. And out there with their instructors. These are the best classrooms. And when you've got kids in particular that are bouncing off the walls, I could ask for a show of hands about how many of you have them, because I'm sure it's a lot. How about putting them in a classroom that has no walls? That's what we can do. Third, we're setting a goal of engaging 1 million volunteers in support of public lands by 2016, effectively tripling the numbers that we have right now. I've served on many trail crews, and I know that volunteering, for me, establishes a connection to place like nothing else. A couple weeks ago, I was in Rock Creek Park with the Rock Creek Conservancy, undercover, removing invasive English ivy from the trees in the park. I'll never look at Rock Creek Park the same way. I now understand how invasives are playing a role there. It also gave me a chance to get to know some people that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten to know. This does, in fact, change lives. And by ramping up a modern version, a 2.0 version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, what we call 21st Century Conservation Service Corps, Interior, U.S. Department of Agriculture, other agencies of the federal family are going to work with AmeriCorps, Student Conservation Association, and other youth corps and veterans groups from around the country to give many more young people these kinds of opportunities that will, in fact, change their lives. So when I was in the Grand Tetons, I had the privilege of engaging with a group of young people that were graduating from the National Park Service Academy, which is something that the superintendent of that park, along with the Student Conservation Association, invented. And these young people from urban areas around the country were talking about their stories. And there was one young man from Jackson, Mississippi, who was a pretty cool guy, I'll tell you. And he talked about first being so cold when he went there in the springtime, because it wasn't like Jackson, and then being there through the summer and riding his bike along the Moose Wilson Road and stopping and looking at the vast Tetons and starting to cry. And he said, I didn't know why I was crying. But it's very clear that this experience in the outdoors moved him. It changed his life, and it can do so with many, many others. So finally, to generate the next generation of stewards of our public lands and to ensure our own skilled and diverse workforce, Interior and other federal land management agencies will provide 100,000 work and training opportunities to young people over the course of the next 4 years. That's hard. There's no doubt it's ambitious, especially in tight budget times. And in order to make it happen, we're going to have to prioritize our budgets. We're going to have to build off successful programs and work in partnership with schools, with nonprofit organizations and communities to leverage existing resources. And we're also going to work with corporate and nonprofit organizations to raise an additional $20 million over 4 years to support these youth work and training opportunities. I know as a business person, businesses want to be part of the solution. I know there are many organizations and individuals that want to see our lands protected and the next generation engaged. And I will pledge to them that we will make sure our taxpayer dollars and our philanthropic contributions work together to make that happen. So in closing, we're continuing to move ahead in fulfilling our mission at the Department. As stewards of our public lands, wildlife, and waters, as managers of our great national parks, in partnership with tribal nations, with states and stakeholders, we will meet the needs of the present generation without sacrificing the rich legacy that we pass on to future generations. This is our commitment to all Americans, and this is my personal commitment to you. It's no different than the promise made by Teddy Roosevelt over a century ago. And Teddy, you can check my words. As he described what he called a great moral issue, he said, I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land. But I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. Of all the questions which can come before this nation, short of the actual preservation of its existence in a great war, there is none which compares in importance with the great central task of leaving this land even a better land for our descendants than it is for us, and training them into a better race to inhabit the land and pass it on. Conservation is a great moral issue, for it involves the patriotic duty of ensuring the safety and continuance of the nation. So as we look to the next 100 years of this nation, the next century of the National Park Service, or the next 5 decades of the Wilderness Act, these words from Roosevelt should serve as a call to action and inspiration to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We covered a lot of topics there, including bear poop, which I don't think we've talked about over the microphone here before, but thank you for that. We have a range of topics to ask questions on today, but let me start with one of the most pressing ones recently because of the shutdown. Parks Director Jonathan Jarvis took a lot of heat over the closures of Washington monuments like World War II. Was there any political motivation behind the barriers that were erected around the national parks?
In 2 words, absolutely not. You know, I've learned a lot of things over the course of 6 months, but particularly over the course of the last few weeks. One is the anti-defense